Hi, Kit. How are you?
I am fine.
How did you find Russia?
Oh, Russia is very interesting to a Kiwi boy all the way from New Zealand.
Is it your first visit to Russia?
Yes, this is my first visit here.
Okay. It was a really important visit for us as well, for the company to Morocco. And of course, we appreciate your effort and long trip. And thank you very much for being with us the whole week. And thanks ahead for this very important for us interview.
No problem at all.
Let's
It's
start.
good.
Okay. The first question is, if somebody would ask you to explain the difference between ordinary milk and A2 milk in a few words, what would you say?
I think the best way is to simply say we're going back to the original milk, the way nature intended. Once upon a time, all milk was A2, and that includes sheep milk, goat milk, camel milk, cow milk, and even human milk. But there was a little mutation which has affected some European cattle, and that has a big effect on digestion and human health.
What was the major push? Why? What was the cause which made you to write the book?
Oh, well, it was back in 2003 that I became aware of the issue. Before then, it had sort of been in the background, but I had just thought, oh, this is just a marketing gimmick. This is not important. And it's a long story, but I became aware of research which had been undertaken both in New Zealand and some other research in the United States. And I looked at this research and I said, this is going to be very important for our dairy industry.
Okay, but you wrote your book in 2007, but till that time, not many sort of researches happened. Did you have enough information to write this book?
I was confident by 2007 that the evidential basis was there, and I would lie awake at nights and I would think, could I be wrong? Is there a chance that I am wrong? And so I would analyse out the issues and I would say to myself, no, I'm confident there's enough smoke here that there's also fire.
Okay, several questions about your book. What made you to name the book with that scary red devil? Is it really that scary, that small peptide you was talking about in your book, that scary for human being?
Well, I certainly thought in the English language it was an appropriate word. It was my choice, it wasn't the publisher. And one of the key things about this BCM7, the beta-casomorphin that comes from the A1 milk, or the A1 beta-casein, one of the things is that it hides itself very well. And I couldn't think of a better term than devil in the milk, the hidden little factor there that is so effective in hiding itself, but so important.
And next question. What are the major physiological processes going in a human body when people use ordinary milk, or as you say, A1 milk?
Well, to answer that, first we need to understand that the difference relates to a particular type of casein called beta-casein. And all milk contains beta-casein. But because of this mutation in A1 milk, there's a little difference which has quite a big effect on the way the milk digests. So we get this little fragment breaking off, which has opioid characteristics. No argument about that. It's actually built into the name, casomorphin. So there's no debate at all that this is a little opioid fragment. And we know many of the ways that it acts. One of the first ways it acts is it slows down the passage of food through the system. We've shown this with animals, we've now shown it with humans. We understand the mechanism. Quite simply, the passage of food through the system will slow down when you have A1 beta casein. This will be for everyone. And that sets up the framework for a whole cascading set of events affecting digestion and beyond.
Now we started to talk about human body reaction health. In your book, you speak about risk factors. What type of diseases you mentioned as and beta casein as a risk factor of that disease? Would you list that?
Well, the very first disease that was identified as being where A1 beta casein was a risk factor was in type 1 diabetes. And this is the form of diabetes where you have to have insulin injections, and often it starts showing up when people are still children. So it really affects their life all the way through. And we recognised that it was a risk factor because we could see that wherever in the world where we had populations who were consuming a lot of A1 beta casein, then we were also getting high levels of type 1 diabetes. When we looked at the overall milk consumption, or we looked at the A2 beta consumption, then no important relationships. But when we looked at the A1 beta casein, very strong relationship. Now, this was first published in the New Zealand Medical Journal in 2001. So that was just the starting point, recognising this is a risk factor. And from there on, people have tried to fine-tune this with medical experiments. We've got some good data from animals, very good data, but with humans it's difficult to finally prove things because there's such a long gap from when you consume the beta casein to when you get the disease. It can be many years. So what we're saying, and this is what we're writing in the top level medical journals now on diabetes, we're not trying to claim this as absolute proof, but we're saying very strong risk factor. Wherever we see high A1 beta casein, we see high levels of type 1 diabetes. And as well as that, in animals, we can actually demonstrate it in trials.
And you were talking about diabetes 1 type first, type 1. What about other diseases you mentioned in your book?
Well, the second disease that people started looking at was heart disease. Exactly the same thing was happening, that wherever we had high levels of A1 beta casein in the diet, we had high levels of heart disease. Now, soon after, it was possible to do some trials with rabbits, and that was very clear that the rabbits on A1 beta casein had a high level of arterial plaque, whereas those on A2 did not. We also know using particular markers, the key one being antibodies to oxidized LDL, and we can see that when people are consuming A1 beta casein, we get higher levels than on A2. So the antibodies to oxidized LDL, that's regarded in medical science as a very strong marker of arterial disease.
Okay, thank you. And how beta casein A1 or BCM7 connected to autoimmune immune diseases, such as diabetes number 1 or diabetes 1. Any other immune diseases are connected to that?
Well, those are the key ones where the evidence is stronger. But there are a lot of other autoimmune diseases, such as even eczema and asthma, some of the gluea type of conditions, and getting sinus material throughout the system. The essence of an autoimmune disease is what we call a friendly fire disease. So there's something the body has consumed, and the body tries to attack it, but in the end it actually ends up attacking itself.
Yes. As you said about animal trials and human trials, from this point of view, which evidences you treat as real concrete evidences with no doubts, or which ones should still need to be proved?
Well, the evidence around for example, the slowing down of the passage through the human system, no doubt about that at all. Evidence that the BCM7 is inflammatory, once again, no doubt at all. Very strong evidence both with animals and with humans. I also think that some of the most convincing evidence is in relation to child development. And I've always been very impressed with some of the work that was done here in Russia looking at the effect of BCM7 on child health. Now, the work led by Professor Kost and Dr. Oleg Sokolov and their team, I think that has been really groundbreaking research. What they showed is that, first of all, in babies on infant formula, that a proportion of these babies had considerable levels of BCM7 in the blood, and they were able to show that some babies could not get rid of the BCM7 quickly, and they were susceptible to delayed psychomotor development. Now, the Russian scientists did not know that this was related to a particular type of dairy. As medical scientists, they simply knew it was associated with milk. But when they published their work in an international journal, Peptides, others of us who understood dairy science could say, aha, this can only be coming from the A1 beta-casein, and we can breed cows that are all A2 rather than A1. Some other work by the same team, published later in the journal Peptides, showed that children who suffer from autism have large quantities of BCM7 in their urine. Now, what we can see here happening is that a lot of children with autism have what we call a leaky gut. This means this peptide can get from the stomach or the intestines through into the blood supply, and then, of course, it has all sorts of effects, including that it goes straight to the brain and then causes psychological factors. This is just so important. It's come from here in Russia, and in these areas, Russia is ahead of the rest of the world.
Thank you. It's nice to hear. Keith, epidemiology, sort of medical statistics itself. Is it important to make conclusions, or how can we use epidemiology for our further scientific movements or conclusions?
Epidemiology is incredibly important for human health, particularly those conditions where something happens over here and then it's years later before the disease manifests itself over here. Now, smoking is a classic example. There has never been a clinical trial which has proven that smoking causes cancer. But it does. It does cause cancer and it does cause heart disease. All of the evidence for that is based on epidemiology linked to some pharmacology. For these complex diseases, and this is the same case for some of the diseases associated with A1 beta casein, you just cannot do clinical trials. So we do rely on epidemiology to tell us what is happening.
Okay, that's why it is important to make trials on animals as well.
We have a number of ways of looking at things. We look at what is happening in different populations. So for example, in Russia we know we have exceptionally high levels of heart disease. So then we say, well, what is there in the environment that could be causing this? Those are the sort of questions that epidemiologists ask. Then we go in and we do animal trials, and the advantage with animal trials is that with the right approvals, we can, at the end of the trial, kill the animal and have a look at what is going on inside. With humans, of course, this is not possible.
Understandable.
But there's another thing that we look at, and that's what we call the pharmacology. So we try and understand what are the biochemical reactions going on in the body, and often we can, with blood samples, we can actually get the measures of what is happening. And that is something we can do with humans, so we can see the inflammatory markers that are being affected by A1 beta casein relative to A2 beta casein.
Thank you. According to your knowledge, if any, clinical trials are on around the world?
Yes, there are further clinical trials. There's one clinical trial I know of that it's completed and is working its way through the publication process. And there are several other trials which are registered as ongoing trials. And I'm looking forward to hearing the results of those.
They're mostly in which countries?
They include the United States, Australia and China.
And Keith, understanding all of that, and of course, as I know, you actually educate doctors as well in Australia, in England, in New Zealand. What would be your major advice to doctors about this A2, A1 problem, or how they should behave with their patients?
Yeah, well, probably some of the biggest effect is with pediatricians, doctors who are working with children, because often with children we get a whole range of conditions like asthma, like eczema, like glue ear, like problems with nasal problems, and there's no easy answers. There is no magic bullet. But what we say to doctors, in amongst your kit bag of tools that you can use with these patients, one of the first things you say to the mothers is, why don't you try A2 milk for your children? And the doctors then come back and say to us, this is actually an effective strategy for us, something that I can use in my surgery on a regular basis with patients. From there, it's often word of mouth. When one person has success, or one mother has success and her child is now more healthy, she talks to all her friends, and from there the message just spreads. So doctors are important, but also it's consumers, because consumers know what is going on in their own family. Now, I've had people say to me, I've had people who are involved in the dairy industry, and they come to me and they say, Keith, we don't actually need to know the science anymore. We see it every day at our dinner table in the behaviour of our children, which has improved on the A2 milk.
Amazing. This is magic. And because of that, I would like to talk to you a little bit about opposition and opponents. As I know, when you started this topic, you had a lot of people in opposition to your idea, to your book even. Could you please tell us the short story about that? Was it real?
Well, the opposition was real, and it's important to understand that just like in Russia, the economy is built on oil and gas, our economy is built on the dairy industry. So there are a lot of people who saw this as being very threatening and hoped that the issue would go away, and people who openly criticised in an effort to try and make it go away. But what we've seen, as the body of evidence keeps increasing, and we've seeing within the global dairy industry a recognition that they can't fight this. It won't go away. It's better to join in with this, what is now becoming a global movement. We still have some groups who are oppositional. However, in my own country, the biggest dairy marketing company, Fonterra, is now producing A2 milk products, and indeed almost every other company in New Zealand has an A2 project. And when we look internationally, we see that Nestle, the largest marketer of dairy products in the world, also now has 3 different brands of A2 infant formula. So 2 years ago, 1 year ago, Nestle had no A2 products. Now they have 3. We're still in the early stages of what is developing into a global revolution. But if I look at the United States, for example, 4 years ago, no A2 milk. Now, in 8,000 supermarkets across America. If I look at Australia, the biggest brand of A2 milk, biggest brand of milk is the A2 brand. If I look at infant formula in Australia, the biggest brand by a long, long way is the A2 infant formula. And if I look at China, by far the fastest growing brand is A2. So the whole global dairy industry now is looking at this, and either they have made a public position to produce A2 products, or behind the scenes, below the radar, they are working on their new A2 projects.
Okay, it means that the revolution started, and what could you expect from the point of development level of A2 products in the world? When the whole milk will be A2? Can I ask you that question?
I have no doubt that eventually all milk will be A2. What I can't say with confidence is when that will actually occur. Will it take 20 years? Will it take 50 years? The biggest challenge is that we have to breed the cows that are A2, and this is going to take a while. All I can say with certainty is that the revolution, the dairy revolution to A2, is proceeding. And right now, it's proceeding faster than what I had expected.
And of Russian followers, they read our website, they read your book. As you know, we printed this book here in Russia. They ask a lot of questions. Of course, opposition acts as well, and the major question of opposition was that this is just marketing gimmick. But I think you have a lot of information already you produced for them to shut their mouth. Sorry for that quite phrase, but I don't think they will have platform to say that this is just a marketing because of recession. But Kit, my question is, because A2 can be on the edge of any of other different diseases or researches, I would like you to ask you some questions about, for instance, A2 and gluten-free products. Sometimes people connect them to each other.
I think it is valid to look at them alongside each other. The evidence we have, which is clear, is that both gluten and A1 beta-casein produce these little fragments which are opioid in character. And the key thing is that the gluten foods and the milk foods make up such a big proportion of our diets. So anything that's happening with one of them or both of them is really important. We know that for most people, the A1 beta-casein and the beta-casomorphin 7 is going to be more important than gluten. And one of the reasons for that is that we know that the A1 beta-casein can go straight from the blood supply straight through into the brain, whereas the gluten has more challenges in getting through that blood-brain barrier. So for most people, A1 beta-casein is likely to be a more important issue than gluten. But there are indeed some people, and I'm one of those, who is also intolerant to gluten. So, and what we know is if you've got an intolerance to one, that increases the chances that you'll have an intolerance to the other.
Okay, thank you. Because you started to talk about intolerance, I would like to ask you, intolerance, allergy, is it the same? Because sometimes people say, I'm intolerant to milk. Or sometimes they say, oh, I have intolerance to lactose. Or sometimes they say, I have allergy to milk or allergy to proteins. So could you please explain us in that sort of different opinions? Are they different or the same? I mean,
intolerances and allergies are different. To a scientist who studies these things, the differences are quite clear. But to the general population, there can be a lot of confusion and a lot of crossover. Now, it gets even more complicated because where you have intolerances, that can also lead to allergies. And allergies can be weak or they can be strong. If we're talking about lactose and lactose intolerance, then we are talking about intolerance. That is not an allergy. But when we start talking about the A1 beta protein, or the A1 beta casein, which is a protein, then the story about what is an allergy and what is just intolerance gets a little bit more complicated. But, you know, to biochemists and pharmacologists, it's the nature of the reaction which the body has. I think it's simplest if we just say that for lactose, what we're talking about is that the lactose sugars are fermenting, and that causes a problem largely in the gut. With the A1 beta casein, we're talking about proteins which are actually inflammatory, and that's setting up these counter reactions in the body, and that gets a whole lot more complicated.
By slowing the digestion process, and that's why human body reacts on fermentation of carbohydrates.
Well, certainly because the passage of food is slower when you're on A1 beta casein, that certainly increases the potential to also get fermentation from lactose. So if you have a slight tendency to lactose intolerance, it's likely to be worse with A1 beta casein because the A1 beta casein is causing the lactose to stay longer in your system. Interestingly, A2 beta casein and A1 beta casein, or the A2 and the A1 milks, they both contain lactose. But the effect of any lactose problem is not likely to be much greater with the A1 because of the longer time it's taking to pass through your system.
And as I know, there were a couple of Chinese big human research which showed that results, and they were amazing according to the work was done and the evidence which actually 100% concrete. But it is interesting that in Russia we have some opposition and opponents which complain about Chinese research, and they're taking this investigation and research from 2 points. One point is that Chinese genetically different than Russians, for instance. That's why they are naturally intolerant to milk, but Russians are okay. And this is one point of attack. Another point of attack, that we can't trust Chinese evidence because it was supported by A2 milk financially. What could you answer? How can you clear up that? What could we answer to that opponents?
Well, I think we can accept that there can be genetic differences between different populations. That's a reasonable statement. However, I would point out that, for example, all the work with babies was done here in Russia and with Russian babies.
But when we talk about intolerance?
Well, it's true that some of the very good trials were done in China. If we think of the very first human trial on intolerance that was done, it was done in Australia, and I was brought into that team, and we published those results in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Now, when I look back with hindsight, I can see some things that could have been done better in that trial. We learnt from those, and so did the Chinese, and they did some things better in their trials, which is very good. But there's been a whole progression of work. We started with the epidemiology. With the intolerances, it was interesting. It was actually consumers kept coming back and saying, hey, we can drink this milk, but we couldn't drink that milk. Now, when I wrote the first edition of...
Consumers are not paid by A2.
Certainly not.
Of course.
Certainly not. When I wrote the first edition of my book, I didn't comment too much on intolerances because we didn't have the really strong science at that time. But what's happened over time, we understand more about the pharmacology and the basic mechanisms. Then we do work with animals. Now, I was also involved in the work that was done with rats. Now, that work had some funding from the A2 Milk Company, but half the funding came from the New Zealand government. So both parties were jointly involved in funding it.
The government could see the importance of that.
Sufficiently to put funding in it, and the New Zealand government is now funding further work as well through Auckland University. But the point I want to make is that there's a progression. We went from, first of all, what consumers with intolerances, what consumers were telling us. Then we looked more deeply at the pharmacology. Then we looked at the animal trials. Then we worked with human trials. Now, for that human trial, which was at Curtin University in New Zealand, in Australia, so the A2 Milk Company provides the money, but it's then up to the scientists at Curtin University to do the work. And I was brought in to help them, and we all work together, and we write the paper. It's not the A2 Milk Company that writes the paper. Then to get it published, you send the paper off to a journal. They send it out to referees who are anonymous, who make judgments as to whether this is a worthy paper to publish. And we all make our declarations as authors as to where the funding has come from, for example. In my own case, all my work on those projects, totally unpaid. Totally unpaid. I do it because I think this is a very important topic. So if someone asks me to work, then I try and assist and do that.
So actually you declare that you are independent expert, is it right?
I regard myself as an independent expert. I myself have no shares in any milk company, and more recently, on occasions, I work with a range of companies, some of which some of my projects are involved with the A1, A2 issue. Other projects have nothing to do with that. And so I have had clients that are involved with A2 and other clients that are involved with A1. The key thing is, any work I do is I say I go where the evidence takes me. And the results you get will be the results that are there in the evidence, and that's the way I then write.
Great. Kit, several words about leaking guts.
We don't really see the evidence, the proof that it is getting through into the internal system. One very important part of the answer to that is the Russian work published 4 years later, led by Dr. Sokolov, which showed BCM7 in the urine, particularly high in autistic children, but also present in ordinary children. Now, there's no way you can get it in the urine if it hasn't got there via the internal blood supply.
According to that, because of that, or maybe following that, this leaking gut syndrome, what groups of people are in the highest risk because of that? Or how it's happened? Is it disease or natural physiological stage of the human development? What is that?
All babies have a totally permeable intestine. That has to be for the colostrum to get through. But then as the baby grows up, that all should sort of seal over. So no longer can the big peptides get through. But then as we get older and older and our digestive systems get more tired, then once again our intestines are more likely to become leaky, and these peptides can sneak through. Now, as well as that, there are particular genetic haplotypes, what we call particular genotypes, who are more susceptible to a leaky gut than other types. So, for example, the people who are susceptible to type 1 diabetes, they are also susceptible to having a leaky gut. So those two things go together. Leaky gut lets the peptides get through, and then the peptides can do their damage.
So if I understood you right, elders, they are in a group of risk more than others.
The young children, babies and young children, and the old people. But there will also be a proportion of other people for genetic reasons or because they've been sick. They might have been on various medicines and or viruses. There's a number of things that can give them the leaky gut. Even a stomach ulcer. So a stomach ulcer leaves things wide open for the peptides to flow through.
Exactly. Okay, and because we started to talk about babies and kids, I should ask you about the baby formula products, importance of that, why A2 milk is so making so good money and so much in this product, why they sell it so many and they just got the big market share in Australia and in China, and at the same time why it never happened before, and what is the main difference between a baby formula of A2 and just the ordinary baby formula?
Well, the only difference is once again this A1 protein versus the A2. So the A2 infant formula is made totally from the cows that produce the A2 beta casein. Now, I think for little babies, we're still all agreed that the best option is mother's milk. Nature has designed the human body to produce milk for the little babies. That's the best. But there's all sorts of situations where that's not possible for one reason or another. So where that's not possible, we say we want an infant formula that resembles human milk as close as we can. And when we look at that and we say, you know, when we look at things like the psychomotor development issue, which comes here from Russia, when we look at other evidence that babies that die of sudden infant death syndrome typically have BCM7 in their brainstem, which will have slowed down the respiration rate. We simply, and when we look at type 1 diabetes, we simply say that by going to an A2 infant formula, you're reducing the risk. Now, in my own family, with my own grandchildren, we have strict rules. Granddad, that's me, has said there will only be A2 products being consumed by our grandchildren, just because it reduces the risk factors.
Okay, and some questions from people who already have been on your lectures. It came to us through our website and Facebook. And this is from ladies, of course, because they all cares about their body, weight, beauty, other things. What would you advise to our women if they care about acne, weight loss, other things which are very close to their body, weight and beauty?
If we look at conditions like acne, we can't make any promises. But what we can say, shifting from A1 to A2 is certainly not going to harm, and it may well be very important. So give it a go. In relation to weight loss, we have no reason to say that A2 will help you to lose weight, but we can say, because it should help reduce the bloating and the formation of gas, that you may find that your stomach isn't quite as big as what it was. But as well as that, what people are saying to us is that when they're on A2, they have more energy. And part of that is because we know that the BCM7 goes straight through to the brain. We know that it slows down the respiration rate and that it can give a fogginess in the brain. So people are simply saying, I feel better on the A2 milk. Now, everybody is different, so you can't make promises or guarantees. That would be silly. There's no such thing as a magic bullet. But what we do say is try it, and a lot of people keep coming back to us and saying, yeah, this is making a difference. And of course, this is why the sale of A2 milk products is now growing all across the world.
When do you think A2 dairy will be mainstream, or it is already?
In Australia, it is mainstream. In China, it is fast becoming mainstream. And some of my dairy farmer friends in New Zealand have been saying to me just recently, Keith, I don't know whether you realise this, but A2 is now actually mainstream. So, for instance, in Canterbury, where I live in New Zealand, most of the farmers would now be converting their herds to A2.
And as you know, for Russia, A2 milk is still quite boutique. We hope that with your help and assistance as well, with our effort, with effort of our farmers, and maybe government, but I don't think so. That's my question is, what do you think the government role should be in the process of A2 development?
It wouldn't be appropriate for me to give advice for Russia. I can say that in New Zealand, our government is interested in learning more about the health issues, and then consumers will make their own choice. I would say here in Russia that one of the very interesting factors is the very high level of heart disease. It's exceptionally high compared to most parts of the world. And when you look for reasons for that, you have to ask, could A1 beta casein, which is also very high here in Russia, could that be a key part? The consumption of A1 beta casein, because it's so high in your Russian milk, could that be part of the problem? So it seems to me a very interesting problem or issue for your government is to think about whether this is important, and maybe they could be sponsoring some research, which would not be hard to do. Clinical trials where we measured the biomarkers, all we need to do is take blood from people and see what is happening between the two. But beyond that, it's not my job as a New Zealander to try and tell Russia what it should do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Keith, several last questions. I know you're tired from the whole week being here and meeting with people and scientists and customers even. Thank you very much for that. But still my question is, you met Russian scientists who are involved in the investigation, in the research. In your plans, are you going to work with them closely, on scientific platform? Maybe you will exchange your ideas. What could we expect from them?
Well, one of the most exciting aspects of my time here in Russia has in fact been talking with the scientists, and what I've seen is a very high level of interest. So we've had some very good discussions. Now, in fact, Natalia Kost and I are already co-authors on one paper, and it would be nice if I could work with the Russian scientists. Obviously, language is a key issue, but
it's not very.
But I'm excited by the prospects because we're all working towards the same goal, which is actually all about improving human health.
And Keith, the last question, the very last, I promise. What would be your advice to Russian people according to which milk they should drink? It is
Well,
quite obvious.
Yes, it is obvious from everything else I've said, but essentially I would say to people, in the first case, try it. Just try it and see how you feel, and think about whether it is giving you advantages in the stomach. But then I'd also say that for people like me, even if I couldn't see differences in the stomach, simply to reduce my risk factors for diseases like heart disease, I would personally be trying to use A2 milk. Now, in our refrigerator at home in New Zealand, the only milk we have in the refrigerator is A2 milk.
Okay, thank you very much, Keith. And could you please sign book for us? And this book is Devil in the Milk, written by Keith Woodford and printed in Russia 2018 by publisher of Medical Academy of Sciences. Thank you, Keith. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a real pleasure.